There was a time in America when electricity itself felt new, powerful, and full of promise. A time when turning on a light, starting a motor, or hearing a machine hum to life carried a sense of progress and trust. In that era, one name stood above almost all others. Westinghouse was not just a company. It was reassurance. It was modern life becoming reliable. It was the feeling that the future had finally arrived and that it would work the way it was supposed to. For millions of Americans who are now over 50, the name Westinghouse still carries weight. It brings back memories of heavy appliances, solid switches, and machines that did exactly what they were built to do year after year. Westinghouse meant electricity you could trust, engineering you did not have to question, and products that felt permanent in a world that was rapidly changing. Westinghouse began long before it became a household name in kitchens and basements. It started with George Westinghouse, an inventor and industrialist who believed deeply in the idea that technology should serve people, not confuse them or fail them. At a time when electricity was still dangerous, poorly understood and fiercely debated, Westinghouse pushed for systems that were safer, more efficient, and more practical for everyday use. His commitment to alternating current changed the course of American infrastructure and helped bring reliable power to cities, factories, and eventually homes. As electricity spread across the country, Westinghouse grew alongside it. The company was present at world fairs, power stations, railroads, and industrial plants. Its name appeared on generators, transformers, and control systems that quite literally powered America. This was not marketing hype. Westinghouse equipment ran cities. It lit streets. It moved trains. It kept factories operating day and night. When people saw the Westinghouse name, they associated it with things that did not fail, because failure was not an option. That reputation naturally followed Westinghouse into the home. As American houses became electrified, families needed appliances they could rely on. Refrigerators replaced ice boxes. Electric ranges replaced coal and gas stoves. Fans replaced open windows and hand-powered solutions. These were not luxury novelties. They were essential tools for modern living. Westinghouse entered this space with the same philosophy it used in power generation. Build it strong, build it simply, build it to last. A Westinghouse refrigerator from the mid-20th century was not designed with style trends in mind. It was designed to preserve food safely and consistently for decades. Thick steel cabinets, heavy hinges, powerful compressors, and straightforward controls made these machines feel more like industrial equipment than consumer products. Many of them weighed far more than modern refrigerators, and for good reason. They were built from materials meant to endure constant use. The same could be said for Westinghouse electric ranges. These were not disposable kitchen tools. They were permanent fixtures. Cast iron elements, solid knobs, and wiring designed to handle years of heat cycles without complaint made these stoves feel unbreakable. Families cooked thousands of meals on them. Holidays, birthdays, weeknight dinners, and quiet mornings all happened in front of appliances that simply worked without demanding attention. Westinghouse fans were another staple. Before central air conditioning became widespread, electric fans were essential for comfort. A Westinghouse fan was heavy, stable, and powerful. Metal blades, strong motors, and simple speed controls meant they could run for hours every day during hot summers. Many families passed these fans down through generations, moving them from room to room year after year, without ever questioning whether they would turn on. What tied all these products together was not just quality, but confidence. People trusted Westinghouse in a way that is difficult to explain today. When you bought a Westinghouse appliance, you were not worried about extended warranties or service plans. You did not read dozens of reviews. You did not expect failure. The assumption was that the product would do its job quietly in the background of your life. This trust was reinforced by how Westinghouse presented itself. Advertising from that era did not focus on flashy features or constant upgrades. It emphasized reliability, safety, and engineering excellence. The message was clear. This was a company that understood electricity better than almost anyone else, and that knowledge flowed directly into the products in your home. For the American family, especially those building their lives after the Second World War, Westinghouse appliances represented stability. They were part of the promise that modern technology would make life easier, cleaner, and more predictable. Owning a Westinghouse refrigerator or stove felt like making a smart, responsible decision. It was the kind of purchase you made once and expected to never think about again. And for a long time, that expectation was met. Westinghouse appliances became fixtures in homes across the country. They blended into daily life so completely that people often forgot they were there. They just worked. When something did go wrong, it was usually after decades of service, not years. Repairs were straightforward. Parts were available. The machines were designed to be understood and fixed by human hands. This was the era when Westinghouse was more than a brand. It was a symbol of American engineering confidence. It stood for a belief that companies had a responsibility to build things properly, because those things would become part of people's lives. It was a time when progress felt solid, not fragile. But history has a way of changing even the strongest names. The world moved forward, markets shifted, and corporate priorities evolved. The forces that once built Westinghouse into a pillar of American life slowly began to pull it apart. What had been a unified identity rooted in engineering excellence would eventually become something very different. For now, though, it is important to remember what Westinghouse once was. A company that powered cities and homes. A name that stood for trust without explanation. A presence in American life that felt permanent and dependable. For millions of people, Westinghouse was not just on the appliance in the kitchen or the fan in the bedroom. It was part of the foundation of modern living, back when it worked. As decades passed, the world around Westinghouse began to change in ways that were not immediately visible to the average consumer. From the outside, the name still carried weight. It still appeared on appliances. It still sounded familiar and trustworthy. But inside the company and around it, the priorities were slowly shifting. What once had been driven by engineering and long-term thinking was increasingly influenced by financial pressure, corporate restructuring, and a growing obsession with short-term results. The American manufacturing landscape was changing rapidly. Competition increased. Production costs rose. Globalization began reshaping how and where products were made. For companies like Westinghouse, which had built their identity on heavy industry and robust engineering, adapting to this new reality was not simple. The systems that once rewarded durability and over-engineering were being replaced by systems that rewarded efficiency, speed, and cost reduction. Westinghouse was no longer just competing on quality. It was competing on price, margins, and shareholder expectations. Slowly, decisions that would have been unthinkable in earlier decades became normal. Materials were reconsidered. Manufacturing processes were streamlined. Long-term durability was no longer the central selling point. Instead, features, styling, and production efficiency started to take precedence. At the same time, Westinghouse as a corporation became increasingly complex. The company expanded into multiple industries far beyond home appliances. Power generation, nuclear energy, broadcasting, defense, and electronics all became part of the corporate structure. This diversification diluted focus. Home appliances, once a proud extension of Westinghouse engineering excellence, became just one segment among many. As leadership priorities shifted, the connection between the brand and the people who used its products began to weaken. Decisions were made further away from the factory floor and further away from the consumer. The people designing and approving appliances were often no longer the people who had grown up trusting the brand themselves. The emotional bond that once existed between Westinghouse and American households slowly eroded. Then came the licensing era. This was the turning point that many consumers did not fully notice until much later. The Westinghouse name, once tightly controlled and deeply protected, began to be licensed to other manufacturers. In practical terms, this meant that products could carry the Westinghouse logo without being designed or built by the original Westinghouse organization. To the average shopper, the name still looked the same. The familiar lettering suggested continuity. But behind the scenes, the standards had changed. Different factories, different materials, different priorities. The Westinghouse name was no longer a guarantee of how something was built. It was simply a label applied to a product designed to compete in a crowded and increasingly disposable market. This transition marked the loss of identity. A brand that once stood for engineering excellence now stood for recognition alone. The meaning behind the name had been separated from the name itself. What remained was familiarity without substance. For consumers who remembered the old Westinghouse, this created confusion and disappointment. The product looked right. The logo felt right. But the experience was no longer the same. Appliances began to feel lighter. Controls became less intuitive. Components that once lasted decades were now designed with limited lifespans in mind. Repairs became more difficult. Replacement parts were harder to find. What had once been machines meant to be serviced and maintained became machines meant to be replaced. This was not unique to Westinghouse. Many American brands went through similar transformations. But the difference was that Westinghouse had once represented something much bigger than appliances. It represented the electrical backbone of the nation. When that kind of brand loses its identity, the loss feels deeper and more personal. For families who had grown up with Westinghouse in their homes, the change felt like betrayal. They had trusted the name without hesitation. They had recommended it to friends and relatives. They had built routines around products that never let them down. Now they found themselves dealing with breakdowns, inconsistent performance, and a sense that something essential had been lost. The emotional impact of this shift should not be underestimated. For the 50-plus generation, brands like Westinghouse were not just companies. They were part of the social contract between manufacturers and consumers. You built things right. We trusted you. That unspoken agreement defined an era of American consumption that no longer exists in the same way. As licensing expanded and ownership structures changed, the original Westinghouse Corporation gradually faded from public consciousness. The name remained, but the company behind it became fragmented and distant. Younger generations encountered Westinghouse as just another brand on a shelf, without any understanding of its legacy. Older generations recognized the name, but no longer recognized the product. This is how a powerful brand becomes hollow. Not through one dramatic collapse, but through a series of quiet compromises. Each decision makes sense on its own. Reduce costs here, outsource production there, license the name to stay competitive. But together, they slowly erase what made the brand meaningful in the first place. By the time many consumers realized what had happened, it was already too late. The Westinghouse they remembered was gone. What remained was a shadow, a name disconnected from its roots, a symbol without substance. And yet, the memory persists. People still talk about old Westinghouse appliances that ran for decades. They still share stories of refrigerators that outlived kitchens and fans that never failed. These stories are not exaggerations. They are reminders of a time when the name meant something very specific and very real. If you remember Westinghouse in your home, or if your parents or grandparents trusted that name without question, you are not alone. Millions of Americans share that memory. And those memories matter, because they explain why the loss of brands like Westinghouse feels so significant. If this story brings back memories for you, take a moment to share them. Leave a comment about the Westinghouse product you remember, or the one that lasted longer than anyone expected. And if stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing. This channel exists to remember the brands that built American life back when it worked. The disappearance of Westinghouse as a meaningful presence in American homes did not happen overnight, and it did not happen loudly. There was no single moment when the lights went out and people realized the brand was gone. Instead, it faded quietly into the background of modern life, becoming something very different from what it once was. This quiet fading is what makes the story so unsettling, because it mirrors a broader shift in how products are made, sold, and valued today. For many Americans over 50, Westinghouse exists now mostly in memory. It is recalled through stories rather than current experiences. Someone remembers a refrigerator that never failed. Someone else remembers a fan that ran every summer without complaint. These memories are often followed by a pause, then a realization. You cannot buy that anymore. Not really. You can buy something with the same name, but not the same soul. This is where the idea of a strong brand turning into an empty name becomes painfully clear. A brand like Westinghouse was never just about recognition. It was about standards. It was about an internal culture that valued engineering, testing, and long-term reliability. When those internal values disappear, the brand becomes little more than ink on metal or plastic. In today's marketplace, the Westinghouse name still appears from time to time. It may show up on a television, a small appliance, or an electronic accessory, but the reaction it receives is very different from the past. Instead of confidence, there is uncertainty. Instead of trust, there is hesitation. Older consumers recognize the name but no longer assume quality. Younger consumers often do not recognize it at all. This shift highlights a deeper truth about modern consumption. Names used to mean something because they were backed by decades of consistent behavior. Today, names are often treated as assets to be bought, sold, and reused. The emotional connection that once tied a company to its customers has been replaced by market logic. If a name still has recognition, it can be licensed. If it no longer performs, it can be repurposed or abandoned. Westinghouse became a victim of this logic. Its name survived, but its essence did not. The engineers who once designed machines to last longer than expected were replaced by systems designed to optimize costs and cycles. Durability became optional. Repairability became inconvenient. Longevity became a liability rather than a virtue. For the generation that grew up with Westinghouse, this change represents more than the loss of a brand. It represents the loss of a philosophy. There was a time when buying an appliance was an act of confidence. You did not worry about whether it would fail. You did not expect to replace it in a few years. You assumed it would simply become part of your life. Modern products demand attention. They break, they malfunction. They require updates, replacements, and constant decisions. This constant friction stands in sharp contrast to the quiet reliability of older machines. Westinghouse appliances were not exciting. They were not designed to impress guests. They were designed to disappear into daily life, which is exactly what made them valuable. The disappearance of Westinghouse from this role leaves a gap that has never been fully filled. Other brands have tried to claim the language of durability, but few have delivered it consistently. Marketing promises what engineering no longer guarantees. Consumers are left navigating a marketplace filled with choice, but lacking trust. This is why the memory of Westinghouse remains so powerful. It is not just nostalgia for old objects. It is nostalgia for certainty. For a time when progress felt solid and predictable. For a relationship between manufacturer and consumer that felt honest. When people say they do not make them like that anymore, they are not simply talking about materials. They are talking about intention. They are talking about a time when products were built to serve people, not cycles of replacement. Westinghouse embodied that intention for much of its existence. The irony is that Westinghouse helped create the modern electrical world that eventually made its own philosophy obsolete. By bringing reliable power into homes, it enabled a culture of convenience and abundance. That same culture later demanded cheaper, faster, and more disposable products. The very success of companies like Westinghouse helped lay the groundwork for the system that replaced them. Looking back, it is easy to see where things changed, but much harder to reverse them. The skills, values, and patience required to build truly durable products are no longer rewarded in the same way. Consumers want reliability, but the market rewards novelty. Companies talk about sustainability, but build for replacement. Westinghouse serves as a reminder of what is possible when engineering leads and marketing follows. It shows that trust can be built slowly and destroyed quietly. It also shows that once trust is gone, no amount of branding can fully replace it. For those who remember the old Westinghouse, the story is bittersweet. There is pride in having lived through an era of solid craftsmanship. There is sadness in knowing that era has passed. But there is also value in remembering it clearly, without exaggeration or denial. Remembering Westinghouse is not about rejecting the present. It is about understanding the path that led here. It is about recognizing that progress does not always mean improvement, and that something important can be lost without anyone noticing at first. The name Westinghouse once powered American homes in a very real sense. Today, it powers memories. And those memories matter because they remind us that things can be built differently. They remind us that reliability was once normal, not exceptional. They remind us of a time when buying something meant trusting it completely. That trust is what vanished. Not all at once, but piece by piece. And once it was gone, the brand that had stood for so much became just another name, a name that still echoes quietly in the homes and lives of those who remember how it used to work.